excited, thank you, Lynn, but scared. It's scary being up here. I think Ben mentioned this last week. It's a great responsibility. And I'm scared because this is like the first time that I've preached at Hillfields. In fact, it's the first time I've preached since before COVID. And from last week, I'm also scared because Ben did such an amazing job last week. His preach was so hard-hitting and challenging, and I kind of went up to him afterwards and said, I don't know how I'm going to follow that, because my preach is just not going to be as hard-hitting as yours. And he actually gave me permission to be good cop to his bad cop, which kind of took the pressure off a little bit. Now, I want to start just by giving you, just telling you a little bit about my preaching journey. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about myself. I don't want to talk about myself at all, really. But this is really relevant to the word that I'm going to bring you later on. So when you first become a Christian and you give your life to Jesus, we call it giving your life to Jesus, but that's a whole process. And it takes so long, and you come to all these stages in your Christian walk of giving bits of your life to Jesus. So in my Christian journey, I'd been giving bits of my life to Jesus, and then he would show me other bits that I hadn't given to him, and I would give more bits to him. And I came to this kind of time, maybe in the early 2000s, when it's like, Lord, I just want to give you everything. I want to give you every little bit of me. I want to do your will. Whatever it is you call me to do, Lord, that is what I want you to do. You want me to go abroad and be a missionary? I'll do that. Whatever it is, Lord. But don't ask me to do anything at the front of the church. As a member of the youth at my old church, we were quite often asked to do readings and stuff like that at the front. And I would go up, and my hands would be shaking, my legs would be shaking, my heart would be beating so hard I think other people in the congregation could hear it. I'd be reading the words, and I'd get to the end of the passage, and I'd realize I'd forgotten to breathe. I'd forgotten how to breathe. I'd be out of breath, but I'd forget how to breathe in. I was so nervous. And naturally, I'm not a particularly confident person. I'm quite a shy person. And I didn't know anything about public speaking. And I just really didn't like it. So it wasn't what I wanted to do. But God's got a great sense of humour. And that's exactly what he called me to do. Now, I ignored that call for 2 years, as we do sometimes when God calls us to do something that we don't really want to do. But one day, after those 2 years, I was in my old church, and I was sat at the back of the congregation. I still remember the seat I was sat in. And there was a guy preaching at the front, and he was a great man of God. Very wise, lovely, lovely guy, strong Christian. And he was preaching the gospel. Not just any preach, he was preaching the actual gospel of Christ. God sent his son, Jesus, to die for us on a cross, that we might have everlasting life. And he is alive today. You can't get a better preach than that. But this guy, I don't know whether he was having a bad day, but he preached it flat. There was no expression, there was no passion. He wasn't using his arms, he wasn't walking around the stage. He preached it flat. And I'm sat at the back of the congregation, and in my head I'm thinking, oh my goodness, how can you preach the gospel with no passion? I'm having a real moan in my head. And as I'm having a real moan in my head, I hear God speak to me. Now, I've been a Christian for 37 years, and I've only heard God's voice, his real voice, in my head 3 times in that 37 years. This was the first time God said to me, well, if you think you can do better, And I didn't hear the ... after that, but there was definitely a ... after that. And that ... was heavy in the air because it meant, Lara, I want you to put your money where your mouth is. And when you hear the voice of God in your head, you've got no choice but to respond to that, and that is what I did. Now, I was in the Methodist Church, and to be a local preacher in the Methodist Church, and I think the Anglican Church is the same, you need to be put forward by somebody in the know, somebody high up, and you need to be accepted. And once you're accepted, you're called it's called a local preacher on note. And I think that stems from when John Wesley himself would give his local preachers a note, handwritten, to take to other churches to say that they were allowed to preach. But that kind of title stuck. So I was a local preacher on note. And when you're a local preacher on note, you shadow another local preacher around the circuit of churches, and it's about 12 churches in the Kingswood circuit at the time. So you'd shadow another local preacher who'd become your mentor. And you might be given a reading to do every now and again, or a prayer, and eventually you'd work your way up to doing a whole service by yourself. And that service would be marked. So if that service was okay, and that it was agreed in the local preachers' meeting that you could be, you could go forward, you would then be a local preacher on trial. It did feel like a bit of a trial, but it wasn't as bad as it sounds. And then you could go out into these 12 churches and you could preach by yourself. Every now and again, you'd get your sermon marked by somebody. So everything had to be written down. You had to be able to give your sermon to somebody to kind of write down. And while you're doing that, you're also doing a 16-module course. And at the end of each one of those modules, there's an essay to write. And that essay gets sent externally to be marked and has to come back, and you have to get a certain grade to pass. And then each week, you go through this kind of 16-module program with your tutor. And for me, that took 4 years. I was doing my training for 4 years, and I was fully accredited in a special service in 2008. So I'm qualified to preach, right? I'm qualified to be here, standing here, doing this message to you now. I must know all there is to know about preaching, right? Well, I just want to get, my mouth is going so dry. I don't know how you get up there and do this, Rich, without guzzling gallons of water. I've got to have a drink, sorry. My tongue is sticking to the roof of my mouth. I just want to give you a bit of a background into what I was taught, to show how those 4 years of training, all that study and the essay writing, and then 14 years of preaching experience don't seem to have prepared me for being up here right now and preaching at Hillfields. Now, this was the one thing I was most nervous about was turning the pages on my script. So the Methodist Church, like many kind of traditional churches, like the Anglican Church, their services are pretty prescribed. They have a set kind of order that things are meant to happen. Nothing like Hillfields whatsoever. And the local preachers, like the ministers, when the local preacher goes to the church, they're responsible for the whole service, for the planning of the songs, the music that's played, the prayers, the preach, everything that happens in that service, a local preacher, like a minister, is responsible for. There's no kind of worship team leading worship, somebody else coming to do prayers. It's the local preacher is it. But in this kind of set program that we're given, there's certain things that we have to do. And the first thing that we have to kind of plan for and choose, there are prayers. And in a standard service, there are 5 particular prayers that you have to deliver. And you can either write these yourself, or you can find there's copious amounts of books that you can find these prayers to read from. So the first prayers you say way before the sermon starts, you have a prayers of adoration where you tell God how great he is. And you have your prayers of confession to say how not great you are or have been that week. And that kind of prepares you for the sermon. And then after the sermon, you have your prayers of thanksgiving. So you're thanking God for all he's done for you. And then you have your prayers of intercession, which is praying for other people. And somewhere in amongst that lot, you have the Lord's Prayer as well. Sorry, I've lost my space. So you've got your 5 prayers that you have to fit into the service. But you've also got 5 hymns to pick. And those hymns, again, not all sang together. You can't put them together. They are spaced through the service. So these hymns in the Methodist churches, most Methodist churches have a big, thick blue hymn book, hardback, full of hymns from long ago. It wasn't the same in my church. My personal church was a little bit different. We were a bit more modern. We had a band and we sang modern songs, but most of the churches in our circuit of churches, very traditional. They liked their hymns. They liked their organ playing. And my mentor had a particular way of choosing hymns, and because she marked my services, I kind of went along with that for a time while she was marking my services. She liked the hymns to be chosen from different centuries. So that didn't include the 21st century, because we weren't even in the 21st century then, but it didn't really include the 20th century, because not many songs or hymns in the hymn book were from the 20th century. So really, I had to choose 5 hymns from 5 different centuries, which would be the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, and 19th century. Now, this was the bane of my life, because I didn't really know very many hymns, so I hated choosing these 5 hymns and having to get them from 5 different centuries. But it was also helpful if one of them was a Charles Wesley hymn, because we were Methodists and Charles Wesley was Methodist. So I had to think about that as well. 5 hymns, 5 different centuries, one of them a Charles Wesley. She also liked them to be a different meter, and I think that's kind of the tempo, the syllables in a line, I don't know, but I had to think about the meter of the hymns. And then obviously the theme as well, because it was quite useful if some of the hymns went with the theme of your service. So we've got the 5 prayers and the 5 hymns interspersed throughout the service. And of course you stand up for the hymns, but you sit down for the prayers. So there was a lot of standing up and sitting down. We used to call it a prayer hymn sandwich. And then in amongst that, you've got 3 or 4 Bible readings. And these aren't just any old Bible readings. You pick them, or you find them in what's called the lectionary. And the lectionary is a whole list of readings for every Sunday over 3 years. So any given Sunday has a particular set of readings for it. So you open up the lectionary and you look at what Sunday you're preaching, and it gives you the readings that you've got. And one of those readings is an Old Testament reading. One of them is a gospel. One of them is a reading from the New Testament that isn't the gospel. And then you'd have a psalm, which you would probably use for your call to worship at the beginning of the service. And you had to look at all these readings and somehow find a link, a theme, a thread to use for your sermon, which wasn't always easy. And if there were children in the particular church you were going to, which a lot of them didn't have, sadly, but if there were, you'd do a children's talk as well. And then you'd do an offering, and after the offering, there was a prayer as well. And then right at the end of the service, there'd be a blessing. The thing is with these more traditional churches is they liked their services completed within an hour. So within that hour, you've got 5 hymns, 5 prayers, 4 readings, a children's talk, an offering, and a blessing. So really, there's only 10 or 15 minutes left to do your sermon. So all through my training and all through my preaching experiences, I've only ever done a 10 or 15-minute sermon. And as we all know, sermons at Hillfields tend to be a bit longer. Just a tad. So now you know why I'm so nervous and why my mouth is still really dry. Everything I know about preaching, everything that I've been taught, doesn't seem so useful right about now when I'm expected to preach for an hour or more. I don't think it's going to be that long. But I do know that it is God who has called me to do this. I do know that it is God who has given me a message today to relay to you. And I do know that God is up here, standing with me as I'm here. Because it isn't what I know. It's nothing to do with what I know, but it's who I know. And that is the title of our message today. It's not what you know, it's who you know. When you know the creator of the universe, when you know him in your heart, then anything is possible. Now, Peter, the disciple, found himself in a similar position when Jesus told him to go fishing. His lifetime of training and experience as a fisherman seemed completely inadequate at that moment. If you'd like to open your Bibles or flick on your phone screens to Luke 5, verses 1 to 11. Luke 5, verses 1 to 11, it's when Peter is first called by Jesus. And while you've got that, if you've got your actual Bibles, can you bookmark John 21, because we'll be going in there a bit later as well. So Luke 5 and John 21. And I just want to clarify for anybody that's kind of not familiar with church or with scripture or with the Bible stories that I will be referring to Peter as Peter while I'm talking, but you'll see in the Bible readings he may be called Simon or Simon Peter, but Jesus kind of changed his name at one point from Simon to Peter, so he's kind of known as both or both together. So let's look at Luke 5 from verse 1. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and that's also known as the Sea of Galilee, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. Now, I just want to stop there a minute. This isn't really anything to do with my preach, but I thought this was a really interesting point. Because the fishermen are washing their nets. But when we read in a moment, verse 5, we see that Peter say, "Master, we've worked hard all night and we haven't caught anything." So the fishermen are washing their nets, but they hadn't had a productive fish. And I'm thinking, why are they washing their nets? Why are they having to clean their nets? And some of us older folk who are here might remember back in the day, before the time of iPhones and iPads, as children, we used to amuse ourselves. And I'm sure some of us went to the lake at Eastfield Park or St. George's Park with our fishing rods and our little jars ready to catch stickleback. There you go, stickleback. And I remember doing this myself with my net. And I used to see all the other kids around me, and they'd have their jars filled with stickleback or newts. Oh, I was so jealous if somebody caught a newt. But for whatever reason, I had my fishing net on the ones on a pole with a little net on the end. And I would be trying to catch fish, but all I would catch would be pondweed. And because it was Eastfield Park, I guess if you had a bigger net, it would probably have been Tesco trolleys and old bikes that you'd have caught in the pond. But that's the thing about empty nets. They pick up rubbish, they pick up debris, they pick up pondweed. And I don't know whether this is for anybody particular, but when I was reading this is what I felt, that God is saying to someone, you've been casting your net in the wrong place, and you've picked up rubbish, which is weighing you down. Maybe that rubbish is like unhelpful relationships that you've picked up along the way. Those people that you become friends with, but they're a bad influence. They pull you away from Jesus. They pull you away from church. They pull you away from what you know is right. Maybe it's bad habits that you've picked up in your net along the way. And Ben last week was talking about the scrolling that we do through the internet. And I know I'm terrible for Facebook Reels and TikTok of just scrolling through, watching all those videos, when really I should be doing something far more productive and could be actually reading the Word of God. Or maybe the rubbish that you've picked up along the way is those kind of harmful thought patterns that you have that kind of spiral around, and as they're spiraling around, your mood is spiraling down. If you've picked up rubbish along the way as you've been fishing, maybe God is saying to you, it's time to clean your net. Because while your net is full of rubbish, it's not full of God's abundance. And he has so much more for you to fill your nets with than old Tesco shopping trolleys and bikes that are broken. Oh, I'm going to need a refill in a minute, I think. So let's go back to our reading. This is verse 3. Jesus got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then Jesus sat down and taught the people from the boat. So in my head, Peter's in this boat with Jesus, obviously. He's rowed him out from the shore. In my head, he's going to be chilling now. This is his fishing hat. Use your imagination. It's a fishing hat. Make sure I've got it the right way. So Peter's just chilling in the boat. Jesus is there doing his thing. Peter's I imagine he's at the bow of the boat. You know the pointy bit? And he's just, maybe got his hat just it's hot, sunny. He's just got his hat. And he's just chilling in the boat, listening to Jesus. That's in my imagination anyway. And then verse 4, when Jesus had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Now I'm going to stop there right in the middle, because although Luke ploughs on to the next line, I figure some thoughts have to have gone through Peter's head at this point. And I just want you to give me a little bit of an artistic license to explore what these thoughts might have been. So here's Peter with his fishing hat. Jesus has just asked him to let down his nets. Not yet. You had one job, Joab, and I gave you the cue. He is fired. So here's Peter, and this is all in his mind. He's thinking this, but this is my imagination of what he's thinking. He's thinking, who's the fisherman here? I've been out fishing all night and I haven't caught anything. Why are you asking me to drop my nets here? You see that fishing business on the shore, that's mine. I'm partner in that fishing business. I think I might know a little bit more about fishing than you do. What I don't know about fishing, not worth knowing. And Jesus is just there, just looking at Peter. just waiting. Peter carries on. Do you not know why we fish at night? We fish at night because the fish come to the surface. It's dark and it's cool. You're asking me to fish in the day. The sun's out. The fish aren't even going to be there. They're down deep. We're not going to catch any fish. Jesus just looks at Peter. He's waiting. And Peter looking at Jesus. And it's a bit like, it ruined my punchline now, Joab. This is a bit like a standoff in one of those old Clint Eastwood movies. Oh dear. So let's go to verse 5. These thoughts happened momentarily. Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. He's saying, despite all I know about fishing, because it's you who says. Now, Peter already knows something of Jesus, because if we read a few chapters back, Jesus has healed Peter's mother-in-law. I don't know whether Peter was there or not, but he definitely would have heard about it. And we already know through those previous chapters that Jesus has been going through the region, healing people, casting out demons. So he will have already got a name for himself. People will have heard about him, heard who he was. And Peter had just listened to everything that Jesus had just said in the boat at that time. Now, it's not recorded what he said, but we know when Jesus speaks, people listened. He says, because it's you who says. He knows something of this Jesus who is sitting on his boat. So verse 6 says, when they had let their nets down, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. It's a miracle catch. But I'm wondering if some of us who are still paddling in the shallows are also being called into deeper waters. To get serious with God. Are we being called now? We've been paddling in the safe, shallow waters. Are we being called now to get more serious with God? Are we being called to get stuck in his word, to learn more about him? Or maybe we've been serving God, but now God is calling us into something new. Or maybe we're new to the church and we haven't done any serving yet, but we feel like maybe there's something we can volunteer to do around the church to serve. And believe you me, if you want to go into deeper waters, you can always volunteer to clean the toilets on a Monday morning. That's pretty deep waters there. And if God is calling you into something deeper, it's so easy to stall because we're being called out of our comfort zone. And we can kind of argue with God, I don't know enough. I'm not good enough to go on to that next step, to move deeper with you. But we already know it's not about what you know or what you don't know. It's about who you know. When we paddle in the shallows, when we're paddling in the shallows, when we're maybe new Christians and things are easier, we get used to that. It's our comfort zone. It feels safe. But we have got Jesus in our boat. If he is calling you into deeper waters, it's because he wants to fill your nets. If you remember, those nets were full. They were filled with fish, filled. Jesus wants to fulfill his purpose in you. So if he's calling you into deeper waters, do not be scared. Do not fear being called into those deeper waters, because Jesus is in your boat. Now that filling of the nets, it's not representative of any kind of material wealth. It's not about, having more things. It's about living life in the abundance of Jesus, in the fullness of his equipping. It's about the filling of the empty space in us and the fulfilling of our calling in him. We'll read about Peter's response to this. If you look at verse 8, I'm just going to have a drink. Verse 8, Peter's response. When Simon Peter saw this, those full nets of fish, he fell down at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for men." So they pulled up their boats on shore, left everything, and followed him. So Peter was called to something different, but similar. He caught fish, and now he's going to catch men for Jesus. And some of the things that he already knows, the experience he's already had, the things he's already learnt, will be put to good use as he moves forward. And that's a bit like the same as my preaching. Although this is so different to what I did before, it's similar, and everything that I learnt back then in my training and my experience, I can still draw on that knowledge and use today. Nothing is ever wasted in God's kingdom. Everything that we've been through, good or bad, can be used to further God's kingdom. Our own struggles, our own weaknesses can be used to build God's kingdom. Because it's not what you know, it's who you know that makes the difference. Now, I also, if you look back at verse 11, the immediacy of Peter's response, it says, so they pulled up their boats on the shore, left everything and followed him. Literally, they've just come out of the water. They've pulled their boats up and they're following Jesus straight away. They've left all of that behind in an instant. And this kind of reminded me of that bit of Ben's message last week when the early church sold everything they had to help the poor. But these material things, the things that we cling on to in the world, when Jesus moves into our lives, they just don't seem as important anymore, and we can leave them behind. Now, Peter then spent 3 years getting to know Jesus, on the road with him, traveling here, there, and everywhere, hearing him preach, seeing him heal people, seeing miracles, seeing him raise people from the dead. Peter even confesses Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for. But then Jesus is arrested. And while he's on his way to the high priest, under arrest, Peter follows, and he's just skulking in the shadows. And on 3 occasions that night, he denies. Sorry. See, this is the passion of the gospel. He denies he even knows Jesus. 3 years he spent with this man, building a relationship with him. And he comes to the point where he denies he even knows him because he's scared. And then it comes to the crucifixion. The next day, Jesus is hung on that cross. And there's no evidence at all of Peter having even been there. It doesn't mention in the Gospels that Peter was there. And you can imagine, can't you? I mean, gosh, I wouldn't want to see anybody I knew go through that either. You know, you can just imagine the devastation, sense of devastation and grief. But with Peter also there's the shame. There's the shame of knowing that he denied his Lord and Saviour. Sorry, I've lost my space. This is also one of my other big fears, losing my space. Then Jesus hears the news from the women who have returned from the empty tomb. And he then appears to the disciples on 2 separate occasions when they were behind closed doors. And again, there's no record of any interaction between Jesus and Peter at that time. Peter would have been there, but we don't hear about any reconciliation at that point. Can you imagine how awkward it must have felt for Peter with Jesus in the room, knowing that he'd denied him, denied knowing him? Can you imagine the shame he felt? I'm wondering, gosh, does Jesus know? Does he know that I actually denied him 3 times? And I think this worry, this shame became too much for him. Because if you turn over to John 21, where you should have bookmarked, we're going to start at verse 2 and we'll see what Peter did. John 21, starting at verse 2. And they are what John calls the Lake of Tiberias. He's saying they're at the Lake of Tiberias, but again, this was the Sea of Galilee. It had different names, but they're in the same place. Verse 2, Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. And Peter said, I'm going to fish. Now, throughout the Gospels, there's record of Peter being in boats with Jesus. You know, you had the storm on the sea that Jesus calmed. He was in the boat then. You had Jesus walking on the water. Peter was in the boat then and out of the boat, but he was in the boat then. And obviously they use boats to travel across the Sea of Galilee, but there's no record in the Gospel of him ever going back to his fishing. He used boats for travel, didn't go back to fishing. He'd left his nets. At that moment when Jesus called him, he left his nets behind. But here we see Peter going back to fishing. When we mess up, we too can go back to what we used to know, back to our old ways. If you think about, you know, when you're trying to eat healthy, and there's a packet of biscuits there, and you think, oh, I'll just have one. You eat that biscuit, and it's nice. And you think, I'll just have another, that's fine. And once you've had 2 biscuits, you think, I've had 2 now, I might as well eat the whole packet. And that's a bit like us as Christians sometimes. We can mess up. We can find things too hard on our walk with Christ. and end up feeling it's just easier to go back to what we knew, go back to our old lives, go back to what was once familiar. But this is what the other disciples say to Peter at this moment. If we have a look at verse 3 in the John 21 reading, those disciples say, "We'll go with you." Rich is always saying that church is family. Peter had his family with him. And when you've got family with him, you've always got somebody who's got your back. And those disciples say, "We'll come with you." So they went out and got into the boat. But that night, they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So here we are again. While John moves straight on to the next verse, I want us to just imagine the internal dialogue going through Peter's head as he's looking at the man on the shore. Don't be too previous, Joab, please. Other side. You want me to fish from the other side? You think moving my net from here to here is going to mean I catch fish? There's no fish this side. What makes you think there's going to be fish that side? Do you know, 3 years ago, I used to fish in this lake every night. And Jesus is just looking at Peter, waiting. And Peter's thoughts are still rambling. I'm a qualified fisherman, don't you know? Other side makes no sense. And Jesus just looks at Peter. And Peter just looks at Jesus like a standoff in some old Clint Eastwood movie. Joe, I've got it right. Thanks, Jojo. You can just imagine Jesus rolling his eyes at Peter. Is this not ringing any bells, Peter? You know, it's different. It's a different situation, but it's very similar. And Rich preached on this a few weeks ago with the feeding of the 4,000. A few weeks before, Jesus had fed the 5,000, and there were 2 loaves and 5 fish. And this time, a few weeks later, there are 4,000 to feed. And the disciples say, we've got these 7 fish and a few loaves. How are we going to feed the 4,000? And Jesus is just like, oh my goodness. And this is the same thing. You know, this situation is different, but it's so similar. And Peter's just not getting it. But I guess we can give him some allowances because there's a 3-year gap from when he first had that experience to now. And I think the message that comes from what Rich preached before and what I'm saying today is don't expect God to do the same things in the same way all the time. You cannot box God in. You cannot box God in. We need to be ready for him to change things up a little on occasion. But even if he changes things up, he still blesses you. And the blessing in this case with Peter was the same. Carrying on in verse 6, it says, when the disciples did what Jesus asked, when they threw their nets to the other side, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. So all they had to do was moved from this side to this side, and they caught the fish. An empty net this side, full net that side. All they had to do was a 180. You know, the Roman soldiers at that time, for that particular movement, the word was repent. It meant to do an about turn. Soldiers would be going this way with their shields. I don't know what they looked like. I don't know whether they marched. And the person in charge would call repent, and they'd have to do an about turn. God is saying today, if you've made a commitment to me in the past, but you've messed up along the way, and you've gone back to your old life, you've gone back to what was familiar, that's all you need to do, a 180. And I know Rich did a call earlier on, but this is the same. If you've not made a commitment to Jesus, if you've never known Jesus in your life, that's all he's calling you to do, is that 180, turning from the way you were going to face him and go the way that he calls you to do. It's that simple maneuver from one side of the boat to the other. Who would have thought that taking your net from this side and casting it on the other side would mean an empty net would turn into a net full of fish? Oh, why? If you've never made a commitment to Jesus before, if you've never decided to follow him, you might be thinking, well, why would I want to do that 180? What difference is that going to make in my life? But Jesus wants to fill our nets. He wants to fill the empty space in our lives. He wants to provide abundance and fulfillment. Jesus in our lives changes everything. And in the process, he gives us purpose. He gives meaning to our lives when out there our lives are meaningless. Now, the next part of the reading for me is like the gospel in a nutshell. And I have trouble reading it sometimes without getting choked up, because for me it's so powerful. So if I do get choked up, you'll have to forgive me. But we're on verse 7 now of John 21. So they've just hauled in this huge net full of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that is John, by the way, the guy who wrote this gospel. He was so humble he didn't want to name himself, but he still wanted to slip it in there. The disciple who Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It's the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. Now, in this one act, Peter says, "I know you." Sorry. This is the passion of the gospel. It wasn't about what Peter knew before, where he was before, what he had done before. It was all about Jesus. And he jumps out of the boat to be with him. And again, you get this sense of immediacy. It says in John, as soon as he heard it's the Lord, he was gone. He wrapped his outer garment around him. And I thought about the significance of this outer garment. I wanted to know what is the significance of this outer garment? Why was it even written about? Nothing is in the Bible by accident, and I just wanted to explore that. This outer garment would have been his coat or his jacket, a robe, basically. And so I asked God, what do you want me to bring? What is the significance of this robe? And this is what came to me. The robe symbolizes the covering of Peter's shame. The shedding of Jesus' blood covers our own sin so that we can have a relationship with the Father. And when Peter put on that jacket, he was putting on the robe of righteousness that Isaiah speaks of. Not his own righteousness, but the righteousness that comes through Jesus' death and resurrection. Peter was now right before the Lord, and his outer garment covered his shame. Let's just jump to verse 12 to see Jesus' response. This is beautiful. Jesus says, "Come and have breakfast." Isn't that such a wonderful picture? Peter had denied even knowing Jesus. But Jesus says, "Come and eat breakfast with me." To me, that's just the crux of the gospel. No matter what we have done, we can come and eat breakfast with the Lord. And if we carry on with verse 12, it says, "None of the disciples dared ask him, 'Who are you?' because they knew it was the Lord." It was never about what they knew. It was always about whom they knew. And Jesus says to each one of us, "Come and eat breakfast with me. Come sit with me. Come get to know me, and I will fill your net to bursting." If you've known him before and turned away, he says, "Come eat breakfast with me, and my robe of righteousness will cover your shame." There's nothing you can do to separate you from my love. And if you think about all of the shame that Peter felt before that moment, the shame of denying Jesus, Peter went on to be one of the founders of the early church. That shame meant nothing when he met with Jesus. When he put on that robe of righteousness, that shame melted away. It did not stop God using him for his purpose. There is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. There's nothing that we can do that will be so bad that if we don't turn back to him, he can't use us to build his kingdom. Or maybe it's you who feels that God is calling you into deeper waters, into a deeper commitment with him. But you don't feel ready. You don't feel you know enough. You don't feel equipped yet. Or maybe you feel that God is calling you to clean your nets, to get rid of some of the junk so that there is more room for his abundance. But you don't know where to start. Just remember, it's not about what you know. It's about who you know. He is always there to help you through those times, to lead you wherever it is he wants to take you. And there's going to be a time, as there is at the end of every service, for ministry. If you feel that anything in this word has spoken to you, that you can come to the front and get prayers for that. And I know Rich has already done an altar call at the beginning of the service. Or it wasn't even the beginning, Rich, was it? It was kind of halfway through. But maybe there's still someone here who's not invited Jesus into their lives. Maybe you don't know anything about him at all, but something is telling you that you need to do that 180 because all you've got is an empty net. And maybe if that is you, you're struggling with that internal dialogue because this is all so different to anything you've ever known before. Just remember that it isn't about what you know, it's about who you know. Jesus makes the difference. And there may be someone sat here right now and their heart is beating faster, it's beating harder because something is stirring inside you and you know that you need to respond because Jesus is calling you to eat breakfast with him. He wants that personal, up-close relationship with you. You can't get any closer than that. He wants to eat breakfast with you. And your response to that call, to the call Richard did earlier, and if you want to make that a response later on, your response is like putting on that outer garment that Peter put on, and then running to Jesus. That's what it's like, and it is just that simple prayer of commitment. It's like you putting on that outer garment to cover your shame, and then running into Jesus' arms, running home.